It's a frozen and quiet morning on December 7th, 1944. Second Lieutenant Leonard Lomel, a 24-year-old from Brooklyn, New York, stares down at his watch. In the darkness, he can make out the time, 6:40 a.m. The exhausted lieutenant is one of very few officers left leading the 2nd Ranger Battalion up Hill 400. In the blackness of smoke and dawn, he can make out the crest. The Germans are within reach. Bloodied and beaten, dog companies prepared for their next orders as the impending thump from German mortars can be heard in the distance. Without warning, the dug-in Rangers feel the ground shake with each soul-shattering mortar blast. Praying they don't find their target, Lynn Lomel looks around at his fractured company, noting that some of the men are replacements. Storming the beaches in Normandy to secure Point du Hoc now seems like a lifetime ago, not just 6 months. Most of the men had spent years training, were now gone, consumed by the inferno that was the Western Front. Through their bloodied battles in France, it was no indication of what the Hurtgen would look like. If he made it out of here, it would be nothing but faith and good luck. The 24-year-old, looking to one of his most experienced non-commissioned officers, Staff Sergeant Bill McHuff, sees the desperation. The mortars are now within 30 meters of their positions and dialing in quickly. It's now or never. Fight out of the hole or die in it. Over the barrage, McHuff lets out a burst from his Thompson submachine gun. Let's go get the bastards. And in a single swift motion, every man leaps from their holes, in a chorus of chants and whoops, sprinting across open ground to meet their enemy. Lieutenant Lomel is up and moving. Through the explosions, he looks over to see 18-year-old Private First Class Kenneth Harsh appear from his hole, only taking a few steps when Lomel's world turns red. A German mortar tears through the skull of Harsh, killing him instantly. Another man standing next to Lomel drops into a ball on the frozen, bloody ground, weeping for help. Lomel can't stand still. Men around him are being delimbed and ripped into thousands of pieces. The only way to go is forward through the hell. If he can't secure Hill 400, the Battle of the Hurtgen will continue. Without a second of hesitation, he sets out on a full sprint, this heart pounding and ready for death at a moment's notice. Thank you for listening to World on Fire, a World War II podcast. I am Nicholas Schweitzer. And the first series that we're going to do is going to be titled The Breaking Point, and it's going to focus on the Battle of the Hurtgen and episode 1, Into the Trap. And it's important to understand why we started with the Battle of the Hurtgen instead of looking at moments such as D-Day or Stalingrad or, the invasion of Poland. I mean, there's hundreds that we're going to cover over the course of the podcast. But this one I really wanted to start because it really puts into perspective exactly what World War II was, which was a pretty horrific war. It's the biggest loss of life in human history. And the Battle of the Hurtgen is something that we as Americans really don't know. We don't talk about. One of the big reasons why it was horrible. It was a catastrophic loss for the United States Army and for the Allied forces that were pushing east towards Berlin. Now, it's important to understand as we go into this who we're really going to focus on. And who we're really going to focus on is a gentleman by the name of General Courtny Hodges. Now, if we were to look at General Hodges' career in the Army, it's pretty easy to see why he became a general. He was an incredibly good officer, and his story is kind of ironic. He was born in 1887 in Georgia. So in the South, post Civil War, about 20 years, and there was nothing really in his background that pointed to a military career. Now, in 1903, when he was in college, he received an invitation to go to the United States Military Academy at West Point, and he took it. He ended up going, but that's not really where General Hodges' career would start. He would fail out within a couple months due to lack of academic standards and primarily focused in math. He just wasn't cut out for that life. He was not cut out for West Point, and he ended up leaving. It's kind of like, okay, well, how did he go from being a West Point dropout to ended up being the guy, one of the biggest generals, the biggest people in General Omar Bradley's ear, how respected he was. How did he end up getting to that point? And so, what he is in the military, we call them a Mustang. And what a Mustang is a Mustang is an officer that did not start as an officer. They started off enlisted. So it literally means that at some point they've climbed the enlisted ladder up to a specific point, and then they received a commission and joined the Army as a commissioned officer. And that's exactly what Courtny Hodges did. He joined the United States Army in 1907. And by 1909, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant. So it only took him 2 years, and he was commissioned. He was very well known for his acts in the Pancho Villa expedition in Mexico, and that really kind of bolstered who he was and how his higher ups viewed him. When he was sent to Europe in World War I, where he fought valiantly, received the Purple Heart. He was gassed, even to the point to where he lost his eyesight for a short period of time. He would end up getting that back, and we know throughout history that it wasn't always the case that you would get your eyesight back, depending on your exposure and the situation. And there was a lot that went into it. You could be permanently blind. However, Courtny Hodges was a little lucky in that aspect. What's really ironic is in the post-war year, after World War I and before World War II, he was actually sent to teach at the United States Military Academy at West Point. So the same school that he would drop out, fail out, however you want to view it, they would ask him back to be an instructor. And, for all the right reasons. He was a great leader as a young officer in World War I. So the Army definitely valued his experience and who he was. What's really important to understand is what actually took place. There are many accounts that Courtny Hodges was an incredibly violent alcoholic, in a sense of he would drink until he would go into fits. He would fly off the handle. And he's even wrote about it and stated that there were times where he would apologize and say, hey, he would fly off the handle and immediately snap back to reality. Now, obviously, looking back at that, most likely he had some sort of trauma from the First World War. Obviously, that was a horrific war as well. And he most likely dealt with some form of PTSD, and untreated, because at the time the treatments weren't even remotely close to what we do today. And obviously, they had no words such as post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's important going into this. That's important to know about the man that would ultimately make the final decision. While Omar Bradley was in charge of the push east, obviously Dwight D. Eisenhower was with the Allied Supreme Commander, but Omar Bradley was tasked with pushing in Germany. Omar Bradley and Courtny Hodges had an incredibly in-depth and a long relationship. Omar Bradley highly respected Courtny Hodges. He looked up to him. There's a lot of writings that Omar Bradley had written about that proves that he held Courtny Hodges in a very good light. He respected every decision. He trusted every decision that he made. On June 6th, the Allies began their liberation of Europe. And ultimately, it opened up a second front. Joseph Stalin was desperately needing in the Soviet Union. So we can look at that as, well, how long did it take? Right? We look at the continent of Europe. You can only imagine how long it would take to go from the beaches of France across the Channel from the English, and then walk. Obviously, you're not flying. You're not taking a train. You're fighting the whole way there. And amazingly enough, by September, 1940, 1941, 1942, 1943, 1944, 1945, 1946, 1947, 1948, 1949, 1950, 1951, 1952, 1953, 1954, 1955, 1956, 1957, 1958, 1959, 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963, 1964, 1965, 1966, 1967, 1968, 1969, 1970, 1971, 1972, 1973, 1974, 1975, 1976, 1977, 1978, 1979, 1980, 1981, 1982, 1983, 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987, 1988, 1989, 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993, 1994, 1995, 1996, 1997, 1998, 1999, 1998, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 1999, 19 they were on the doorstep. So in 3 months, the Allies were able to push themselves to the doorstep of Nazi Germany. There's a couple cities around the border between Belgium and Germany, and we can go through them all, and I'm not going to bore you to death with that. However, what I will bring up is Cologne. Now, Cologne is not necessarily on the border, but it's close enough. The Allies knew for a fact that most likely the Nazis were going to be having some sort of headquarters there. That was a big piece for them, and it was. Cologne was huge. There's also a city called Aachen, and Aachen is a border city, a border town, whatever you want to call it, and it was going to be well defended. There's one piece of information that I have not brought up yet, and that is the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line was originally brought up in 1936, and by 1939, it was operational. And what it was is it's a thousands of kilometer long defensive perimeter that stretches a very large chunk between the Belgian and German border. And this was made for a few different reasons, one of which was the Maginot Line, which we know that the Germans basically barreled through it. It wasn't really and that's for other reasons. It wasn't because the French were weak. The French were definitely caught off guard in the sense of they did not expect them to come barreling through this defensive perimeter. So the Germans were like, we can do that too, and they developed a insanely in-depth plan to defend this. Now, once France capitulated, it totally took out the need for this defense, in a sense. However, once the Allies made landfall in June of 1944, it kind of brought up the, oh man, we may actually need this again. So Adolf Hitler brought in a gentleman by the name of Field Marshal Walter Model, and Field Marshal Model was a very experienced. He'd fought in North Africa. He was a very good strategist. I think that history kind of does him a disservice in the sense of like, well, okay, well, Hitler didn't like him. Hitler didn't like a lot of his generals, his field marshals. He wasn't a big fan, right? And so we need to look at that. General Model knew for a fact the Allies would be coming that way. Their end goal was Germany. He knew that, and the only way that they could get there was by going through the Siegfried Line. So by 1944, Model had dumped endless resources into preparing the Siegfried Line again. After its somewhat abandonment, not complete abandonment, but it wasn't the focus for the Nazis. However, they began to put in items such as the dragon's teeth, which are they almost look like concrete, traffic cones, pillboxes. They put machine gun nests that had interlocking fields of fire, and mines by the thousands. And this was going to be you are not to step one foot into German territory. Once you got past the Siegfried Line, it was home free, if you will. It was a direct pathway into Germany. So the Germans were prepared to almost throw every single thing they could, and it's important to understand that they were also fighting a war on the Eastern Front as well. The Soviets at this point were definitely putting the pressure on Hitler and the OKW. There's two big things that are in the Siegfried Line, or I guess I should say two big objectives. One of them is the Rhine. The Rhine River. Most of us know what that is. If you don't, it's a very large river that runs down the west coast of Germany, or the wet not coast, the western side of Germany. And it's by far one of the biggest rivers in Germany. And I could be wrong. It could be the biggest river, but I'm not going to assume that. The Germans were using hydroelectric dams on these rivers, the Ruhr and the Rhine. The Americans had no choice. They had to go over the Ruhr in order to get to the Rhine. This is where it kind of gets interesting, because north of Aachen is a place called the Hurtgen Forest. Now, the Hurtgen Forest it's deep green. It's completely covered. It looks like something out of your nightmares. If you get some time, go on to just look it up on Google and see exactly what this place looks like. It's pretty terrifying, and so you can only imagine what kind of fight is getting ready to happen ahead of this. So these hydroelectric dams on the Ruhr became a concern for Courtny Hodges. Courtny Hodges' thoughts on it were that the Germans would utilize the hydroelectric dams and blow them, in a sense, to open the floodgates and flood out all of the Allied advancement. Not necessarily, oh, they're not going to drown them, right? It's more of if we flood it, they can't move. Tanks can't move. Track can't move. Troops are going to be weighted down in the water and the mud, and it slows everything to a halt. Hodges, looking at a map and working with his generals, realized that the best way to get to these dams and to allow the Battle of Aachen to go successfully, and then eventually allow the push for Allied troops across the Ruhr in the Rhine, and then make their way into Germany, would be to seize the opportunity from the Germans from being able to hamper that. Now, if you look at a map of the Hurtgen Forest, you can definitely see that you can just go around it and still accomplish the same thing that he was trying to do. However, the shortest and the fastest way in Hodges' mind was to go right through the middle. And what they did not know was that Walter Modell had anticipated them coming through the Hurtgen. So he doubled down on his defensive measures, what he was preparing. All of his preparations to defend Nazi Germany was being put at the Hurtgen. There's an infamous hill that we'll discuss later called Hill 400, and then from the earlier story of Lieutenant Leonard Lommel, that story was from Hill 400. And Lieutenant Lommel ended up surviving. He would go on to become a very successful attorney on the East Coast of the United States, and was very open about his time in the 2nd Ranger Battalion during World War II, and especially the absolute nightmare that he would endure during the Hurtgen. This is all a big preparation. The Americans were elated that they were this close to Germany. We had exceeded expectations on the liberation of France. After France, the goal was to cross the Rhine, period. Right? So we're ending up on, okay, well, how did we get to the Hurtgen? As I explained before, you gotta control, you've got to knock out every possible thing that could slow you down. You got to keep the pace that you're on. So Courtny Hodges was really given a heavy amount of authority over the first U.S. Army in Europe. Even though Omar Bradley had the ultimate say-so, Courtny Hodges had a very large say-so. Yeah, I would be willing to say that his weight of words was probably 70% more than anybody else. He had a very, and especially with Omar Bradley. On September 16th, the 47th Infantry Regiment would successfully capture Shavenhute on the northern edge of the forest. The preparation to enter the forest immediately began. Thousands of American soldiers readied themselves for whatever they were going to face, if they were going to face anything. They had no idea. This was completely uncharted territory. And 3 days later, on the 19th, the 9th Infantry Division entered the Hurtgen Forest. They entered the forest into a trap. Walter Modell had prepared his men to wait in anticipation. The Hurtgen Forest was pre-sighted by artillery. They had mortars hidden everywhere. They had mines by the thousands on the only, and if I remember correctly, there's only 2 trails that are walkable. So that could not support armor. So these are foot troops on their own, and you're staring down the barrel of wintertime in Europe. And remember, it's middle of September. It's coming quick. You can't get caught in the middle of this. Now, why was there so much emphasis on defense? Well, it's pretty simple. The Germans had discussed, they realized how quick the Allied forces were moving on the west, or in the west. They saw 100% that they were in trouble. They were preparing to take a very large offensive and take it through the middle of the Ardennes, which also happens to be on the German and Belgian border. So the Germans were already preparing. They had more manpower. They were in their backyard. They were already preparing for a fight. They were getting ready. The Americans just so happened to walk in on the wrong time and not expecting, oh, well, maybe we won't get a whole lot of resistance. The Hurtgen Forest was full of nothing but death. And I'm going to stop this episode here. We are going to dive into personal stories on the next episode of the guys who fought in the 3 months of fighting leading up to what would become the Battle of the Bulge once the Germans did finally execute their offensive attack against the Allied forces. So we'll go into the personal stories. Thank you so much for listening. I greatly appreciate it.